Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's still allergy season. I've got my readers on this time because I got to read some notes here, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. If I'm honest, getting old's a lot of fun. We're listening to some Kenny Burrell right now. When Lights Are Low. This is on Concord, I believe. Probably late 70s, early 80s. It's great stuff. I mean, I'm a huge Burrell fan. Larry Gales and Carl Burnett. So 79, so yeah. Again, the artwork in jazz goes from being cutting edge in the early 50s and leading the pack to becoming pretty subordinate, pretty less than by the 70s and 80s. It's kind of shocking how bad jazz titles covers become in that time frame. Like I said, in the 50s, unquestionably, jazz was kind of leading the pack in graphic design. I've had a few episodes demonetized lately for the music being too loud, which I always keep pretty background. But again, I had to block that one fella, Gringo Loco. And I don't like to block people. I mean, I like to give people the freedom to express, but I asked him to kind of repress some of his fundamentalism a little bit and his, he just kept being obnoxious and prejudicial and racist and sexist, and it's just time to let him go. And so, I don't like doing it because I like to let people express themselves. It's part of what jazz is about. It's part of what America's supposed to be about. But this just causing me too much agita, and I didn't want to engage him or validate him by getting into debates with him. And so it's not something I love to do, but it had to be done. I'm going to show you some cafe plays here in a minute. And also going to show you a new tone poet, which I'm excited about. I'll be honest, it's a little less than what I expected, not from the packaging or the guy's tone poet, the job the tone poet did. They always do a great job. It's just a bit of a subdued session from this artist that surprised me a little bit. But first I want to talk about tone poet blue note titles that I want to see being released in the next next couple years. 10, 20 years, my God. As most people probably know who watch the channel, I have the entire blue note canon. I have most of what tone poet has added to it, especially every title that they added that I didn't already have, because they are issuing sequence titles as well, which obviously I already had that. And not much reason to really get those. There was the 1000 sequence that came out in the late 70s, early 80s with those awful white covers with the photographs. And I have a few of those covers in those albums, but Tone Poets actually reissued a lot of that stuff. And some of that stuff was actually issued in Japan and then issued in that 1000 series here in America. But I see there's a cat in the room. But and the Japanese, of course, probably reissued most of what was in the Blue Note vaults. And that's a lot of what Tone Poet has been diving into as well. I mean, a lot of that Sonny Clark stuff, the Tina Brooks stuff, Japan released that stuff in the 70s and 80s. Some that got issued in that 1000 sequence. But, there's a lot of cool stuff from the Blue Note vaults that for one reason or another didn't get issued in the original sequence, mostly for monetary reasons, I'm sure. And unlike some of the labels like Prestige with Bob Weinstock, Alfred and Frank didn't erase tape. They kept those things in the vault. And it's weird, some of the artists hardly have unissued stuff. I don't see a whole lot of Horace Silver stuff that was unissued and came out later. Donald Byrd, most of his stuff came out. He was with Blue Note for fucking ever. Freddie Hubbard, another guy who doesn't seem like there's a lot of stuff in the vaults that wasn't issued. Hubbard was so dynamic at his time at Blue Note, without question. But most of the great Blue Note players were. So some of it had to be dictated by sales, but then you have a guy like Jimmy Smith who, he was their top seller in the 50s. And when he signs with Verve, with Creed Taylor, there was a lot of stuff in the vaults that I don't think it was as much, they just hadn't had the money to really, they just didn't have the time to get around to it. And so after Smith leaves in 60, 61, goes to Verve, Blue Note's issuing Jimmy Smith stuff for the next 5, 6, 7 years, a title a year at least. And so there's Jimmy Smith Blue Note stuff coming out throughout the 60s, even though he's well left the label. But all those sessions obviously will be from 58, 59, 56, 57, 60, maybe into 61. So by the time that stuff, by the time Blue Note sells to Liberty and eventually United Artists, a lot of that Jimmy Smith stuff had made it out in the original sequence. So when it came time for the Japanese to reissue stuff from the vaults, there's not a lot of Jimmy Smith stuff that hadn't already been devaulted. I just made that word up. How's that work for you? Sonny Clark obviously had a lot of stuff that was in the vaults, probably in part because of his drug issues and behavior issues. And I mean, they've already issued a lot of that, but there's still a few titles. So I compiled quite a list of things here. There are probably almost 30 records that I would love to see Tone Poet issue, that I would be happy to anxiously collect. I have some of it through Japanese pressings. I have some of it through that 1000 sequence. But almost all of them, I'd love to have a repackaging with the better, real Blue Note-esque Reed Miles-like covers. Again, there's some titles I don't have in any format at all. Some of the Japanese titles just get really expensive or just are tough to come by. And I will buy them from Japan at times, but I mean, right now I have the money to buy any record hardly. So I mean, that's what's tough right now. So let's dive into this real quick, and I'm just going to do it kind of in a chronological number, and I will kind of highlight 10 that I'm really anxious to receive. First is Art Blakey's Africaine, and Art Blakey's Africaine was a session from '61, and there's not a lot of Jazz Messenger stuff that didn't get issued. I mean, they were one of the preeminent artists on the label. This 61 session actually has Dizzy Reese, the great British Jamaican trumpet player, playing the congas, which is interesting. I mean, adding that African Caribbean flavor. It's a Morgan Shorter, Jamie Merritt lineup. I think Walter Davis on the piano. Why didn't get issued in 61, 62, I'm not sure. Obviously, Blakey was still with Blue Note for quite a while. And like I said, it did get that 1000 sequence issue, but I would love to get that with a nice cover, with a nice Reed Miles-esque release on Tone Poet. That would be a highlight. And I don't have the 1000 sequence. I never did buy it. I hate the cover of it so much. Kenny Burrell, there's one title by him, Freedom, which did get a Music Matters reissue, but the cost of the Music Matters stuff is frankly fucking ridiculous. And no offense to you guys who are making that stuff, people obviously must be buying it, but even the reselling of that stuff that's used, it's in the hundreds of dollars, and frankly it's a little insulting, because I know it doesn't cost you that much to make it, and I mean, supply and demand obviously and so you press it in small enough quantities where the demand stays high enough, and it just has never been in my price range. And there's a few other Burrell titles that I do have from Japan, but Freedom is one I would love to have. And I do like the cover that Music Matters gave it, but I'd like to see Tone Poet reissue that to put it in a more affordable price point. And frankly, I hate the 245 RPM LPs. It's not my thing. There's a Chambers set called High Step. That's a collection of stuff from his work with Coltrane. And a lot of it's the Going West session that was on Imperial. And then obviously some of his work, Whims of Chambers, with so it's not really unreleased, and it's in one of those 2 LP sets. But I mean, it would be fun to see them eventually reissue Whims of Chambers, even though I have the Imperial version of that. Sonny Clark, there's a couple of records here, Art of the Trio and Blues in the Night, and both of them obviously had Japanese reissues. I would like to get Blues in the Night. I mean, I would like to see that with the right cover. I can't remember the group on that, but I mean, I looked at it once or twice. I'm like, oh, that'd be fun to have. Lou Donaldson has a record called Man with a Horn. I'd like to see that reissued at times. And it's amazing how much of Lou Donaldson stuff did get put out at the time. It was pretty prolific. Tommy Flanagan, this one's kind of a real outlier, from '59, Lonely Town. And there's lots of Japanese pressings of this out there, which is probably why it hasn't been done yet. But Flanagan's not a very Blue Note-esque guy. He's definitely more at other labels, Prestige and elsewhere. And why that session didn't get issued, again, who knows? But maybe it's just a contractual thing. And again, the Japanese have issued it with a kind of banal cover. But I would love to see that get a tone poet. Tommy Flanagan's a great player whose career as a leader is quite minimal, which is probably something about his personality. He was kind of a back of the stage kind of guy. I think he was fine with that. You obviously got to pay a little bit more to be a leader on a session, but he certainly has a wide body of work as a sideman and a much smaller body of work as a leader. Curtis Fuller has a record called Two Bones, and the other bone on there is Slide Hampton. And Hampton was an interesting player. A lot of his work was at Atlantic, and he shows up other places. I think he's an Impulse or two, but he shows up in a number of places, and Slide's a great player, and him and Fuller together will be a fun record to hear. And again, the Japanese issued it. I haven't picked it up at any point. Again, the covers in the Japanese even often, they do a better job than that 1000 series did, but they're still not Reed Biles-esque. They're not timeless covers. You're like, oh, I have to have that. I'm going to skip this next artist and come back to, Benny Green, the 45 sessions from 58. I'd love to get a handle on that at some point. There's a couple of Andrew Hill records, Pax and Change from 65, 66. I mean, I'd like to get those, but they're not top of my list for sure. Bobby Hutcherson Patterns, Bobby Hutcherson Eclipse. I think both those had been reissued at one point, but probably could be using a nice Tone Poet reissue. There's a Wynton Kelly session that was actually a 10-inch session from 51. And I think there's quite a few tracks on that for a 10-inch. And I think it'd be fun to see that issued as a Tone Poet. And the graphic design in the Blue Note 10-inch sequence is quite different from the Reed Miles 55 onwards LP era. And Wynton Kelly was a great player. He was an interesting guy, and again, not a real Blue Note stalwart. So it'd be fun to see that added to the canon in a more official capacity. Harold Land, Taking Aim. That record had a 1000 sequence release. Again, Harold Land wasn't a really preeminent Blue Note guy. He was obviously is most well known for being with Clifford Brown, Max Roach, 54, 55, and Emersy, and those great sessions. And that group is one of the most incredible hard bop. Probably really the inventors of hard bop in most ways is that quintet. And of course the Jazz Messengers are right on the heels. The Miles Coltrane quintet's right on the heels. But Max Roach, Clifford Brown, that group was just sonic ecstasy. They were lightning fast tempos, really clean, melodic, beautiful playing. It definitely deviates from bebop. And I think they're kind of the template. They're kind of everybody's listening to that. If you were a jazz player, you were listening to what Clifford Brown and Max Roach were doing. You're like, oh, okay. And I don't think it was a formula. I don't think they sat down and said, we're going to redefine bebop into hard bop. But I think when they started doing what they did and putting more groove in it, more rhythm in it, and more melody, and stating the themes, it had to be called something, and so that it became hard bop. And I'd love to get Harold Land's Blue Note session, Taking Aim, see Tone Poet reissue that. Jackie McLean has a couple of sessions, Jackknife, Consequence, Hypnosis. I like all those had Japanese pressings. I don't listen to Jackie a ton anymore. He's got some great records. He's a very brittle, slightly sharp, at times intentionally, I think, player that always has an edge to him. But, I've always collected his work, and I have everything he did on Blue Note. I think everything he did in his career pretty much up until his time in Europe, and I have quite a bit of that stuff too. And I love Jackie, but they're just not as high on my list of want-to-haves. There's a Mingus with Dolphy session live at Cornell from 64. I'd be intrigued to hear what that sounds like. Hank Mobley has had quite a few Tone Poet issues already, and Mobley again was a Blue Note guy for decades, up until pretty much the time of his death when he was recording some of Far Out Lands and Reach Out and some of that stuff in the late 60s. But there's a number of Mobley sessions that are still prime to be Tone Poet issued. Feeling Good was another one that got issued already, I think, on the Music Matters. And Feeling Good was actually a session that kind of got chopped up. And it got issued on 3 different LPs in 63, 64, and it came on 3 different records, these songs. And eventually they were kind of called together back from the original session and put back together as a record called Feeling Good. And like I said, I think Music Matters, someone has issued it, but I think Tone Poet should issue that. There's another one called Third Season from 67. Another Workout is other stuff from the workout sessions, which I mean, that's not something I'd really like to get my hands on. And I think I know I have a Japanese or some kind of pressing of that, another Workout, but I'd like to get a nice Tone Poet version of that. And then Thinking of Home, which is from 70, which is one of his last records. Again, probably there's some symbolism in that name, Thinking of Home, thinking of mortality. Lee Morgan, Charisma, 66, Standard, 67. Those are both, I mean, I don't like Morgan as much later. I prefer his 50s work when he was really aggressive and tenacious. His 60s work tends to stride between the boogaloo and elements of the avant-garde, but Morgan's such a great player. He just really is, and I appreciate pretty much everything Lee Morgan does. Another record that's high on my list of wants is I Quebec, Easy Living. And I do have a Japanese pressing of Easy Living with a banal cover, but I would love to see, and his other record too, Congo Lament, which has a 1000 series release. I don't have that. I would love to see Easy Living and Congo Lament, both from 62, which was shortly before Ike Quebec's passing. He was an A&R guy for Blue Note, a great tenorman, was a pretty big part of the scene in the 40s. He does a lot of 45 sessions for Blue Note in the 40s, on a more slightly jump blues R&B sense. But when he comes in A&R for Blue Note in late 50s, he does some great stuff. Might as well be Spring, Shades of Blue, Blue and Sentiment. Those records are just fantastic. I love Ike Quebec's sound. He's really rooted in the Ben Webster school. He's obviously got some Lester Young in him. Quebec is a great player that's really kind of forgotten. And had he not been on Blue Note for those 3-4 records he does, he'd probably be completely forgotten. Blue Note certainly elevates the legacy of some people like Ike Quebec. Freddie Red has another section called Red's Blues, which would be fun to get my hands on. He has a couple titles of Blue Note, but I like Freddie Red a lot. Great piano player. Dizzy Reese has a record called Coming On, and I think it would actually be recorded for Blue Note. His other 2 Blue Note sessions, if I remember, were recorded for Transition originally, which Blue Note ended up purchasing and got Transition kind of out of the game. Jimmy Smith has one called 58 Cool Blues, which I don't think that one ever saw the light of day. Maybe in Japan it probably did, but I don't know if it ever did. And there's also a record called Trio with Lou Donaldson, which I have a Japanese pressing of that. So I'd like to see Jimmy Smith issued there. There's a couple Stanley Turrentine records, ZT Blues, Mr. Natural, In Memory. These are from like 61, 64 in that era. I love Stanley Turrentine, one of the great players of the gospel of the blues in mid-60s jazz. He was a real proponent of soul and just the blues. I mean, Turrentine's a real star in terms of my definition. And then Julius Watkins has a session as well, the French horn player, that was right in 55, right in that transitional period between 10-inch and LP. And I'd like to see that Watkins session be issued on Blue Tone Poet as well. And then last but not least here, I would love to see more of the Grant Green stuff that's not official release, given a Tone Poet release. And I think there's 5 titles here that still have not been issued in America properly. And there's the first session from 1960, which I thought that was issued, but I don't think I think it's only on CD still, from what I looked at Discogs. And it gets confusing, because Born to Be Blue I thought was maybe, but it's not that. They're different sessions. Remembering Grant Green from 61, Gooden's Corner from 61, Going West from 62, which was released by Liberty in like 67 or 8 with an awful cover as far as I'm concerned. It's just awful. And then Blues for Lewis from 63. And so 60, 61, 61, 62, 63, those 5 records are all from that period. But when Jimmy Smith leaves Blue Note in 60, 61, they signed Grant Green around that same time, the great guitar player of St. Louis who plays these great bebop lines on guitar. And people don't know this, but Grant Green was the #1 recorded artist by Blue Note from 60 to 65. They recorded a ton of his stuff. And, I mean, a lot of it got issued. A lot of it got put out. And so in some of these sessions, maybe just got sat on because there was so much other stuff that was being released. It's a lot of material Grant Green does in a short period of time there. And so these sessions were never officially released in the original Blue Note canon. Like I said, Going West was issued by Liberty, but I mean, that cover is just forsaken. I love Grant Green stuff. I love jazz guitar in general, whether it's the Kenny Burrell playing with strumming and chording, whether it's the elasticity of Wes Montgomery and his interesting chord inversions and all his different I mean, Montgomery's a really interesting player, and I've had a lot of jazz players who are great players talk to me about how innovative and interesting Wes Montgomery's style is. And most jazz guitar players I know, or even guitar players I know, when it comes to their favorite jazz guitarist, it's almost always Wes Montgomery. It's unfortunate he didn't get more work, Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, versus that body of stuff he does at Verve, which, again, that was paying the bills, and he had like 9 or 10 kids. But that Verve stuff just isn't as good. I mean, it's got so much orchestration behind it. Oliver Nelson and Don Sebastian guys were just putting all this production on those Verve Creed Taylor albums. And it really kind of, I mean, Jimmy Smith goes from being this incredible bebop organ player to playing kind of Broadway tunes with big arrangements behind him. And Jimmy Smith, like Louis Armstrong, can excel at anything. He can do it. But and there's still good records, but there's a reason why his Verve stuff isn't going for what his Blue Note stuff is. And same with Wes Montgomery. I mean, California Dreaming and Tequila. It's fun hearing Wes play those songs, but imagine if he'd been a Blue Note recording with a small jazz combo, how much more we'd probably treasure Wes's body of work. And Wes's Riverside stuff is great, but it's only 5-6 records, maybe 7, and from 60, maybe 59 to 63 or 62. I mean, it's a short body of work where he's at Riverside, and that stuff's great. But man, it's too bad he went to Verve and had to make some of those watered down pop jazz records. And I mean, they're good records. They're not bad. It makes you wonder where some of these guys' career would have gone, including Kenny Burrell, including Wes Montgomery, including Bill Evans, Cal Tjader. I mean, it's a long list of guys that Creed Taylor hijacks from all the small labels and has them make this coffee table jazz with the beautiful gatefolds and the bigger arrangements and production values. And I mean, Creed Taylor had a vision, you have to acknowledge that. And Impulse didn't quite meet what he wanted, so he really made that happen at Verve. And I mean, the gap between Creed Taylor Verve and Norman Granz Verve, it's voluminous. So yeah, the Grant Green stuff I would love to get. Gooden's Corner, Remembering, Blue, all that stuff would be, and I'm sure they'll get to it. And I'm guessing a lot of the stuff I've talked to you about is on their radar. Gray and Joe Harley and Kevin Gray. I'm sure this stuff is on their radar. They know this stuff probably better than anybody does. But I mean, it's amazing how much stuff is out there still. As much as Tone Poet has issued, there's still a ton of Blue Note stuff that is waiting to have a nice official American vinyl release with the proper artwork and the photographs. And so, I mean, there's a lot of Tone Poet stuff yet to be excited about. And they have years of material to still delve into and to share with us. And that's not to mention, I mean, they did most of the transition stuff in this last year, it looks like. And they're adding some Pacific stuff as well, which is, I mean, they just reissued this record from Pacific, Good Friday Blues, which is Jim Hall, Red Mitchell, and Red Kelly. And that's a great little trio. And interestingly enough, Red Mitchell, who was a preeminent bass player in the white West Coast jazz scene, he's playing piano on this, which kind of caught me off guard. And Jim Hall is always worth the price of admission. It's a cool cover. It's one of the more expensive Pacific jazz titles from the PJ sequence. When you get into the PJ, which is like 1960, 59, they start this new series. This is number 10. And cool. It's a great record. It's a great listen. I mean, it is what it is. It's West Coast cool, and I mean, good Friday blues. That's what you're going to get from that for sure. So diving into the new Tone Poet, and it's a record that's been on my radar for a while. And I knew it was coming this year, so I was kind of excited about it. Lee Morgan Taru, and it's a strange lineup for Blue Note. Benny Maupin, George Benson, John Hicks, Reggie Workman, and Billy Higgins. And I think in some part, the lineup is what makes the record the departure that it is. Which, I mean, any good jazz player needs to be sensitive to who his lineup is. And this is Morgan in a fairly subdued, almost R&B at times. I mean, it's got some soul jazz, a bit of boogaloo at times, but there's no real hard bop or intensity or even up-tempo. Nothing that even resembles the avant-garde or anything out. It's probably as subdued a session as I've ever heard Lee Morgan do in this period, and it's from '68, which puts it right after the sale, to be honest. And again, having Benny Maupin, who, I mean, he's a fantastic R&B horn player, and obviously this is his jazz roots here. And Benson, of course, is one of the most important guitar players ever. I mean, Benson's a bit of a later generation and more of a contemporary of the 70s, but his roots do come up in the 60s with Jack McDuff, and his early work at Prestige is fantastic. I mean, it comes out of the Pittsburgh, out of the hillside there, and a real poor neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And I mean, Benson's still with us, if I remember. Benson's such a great player. And his 70s work for CTI and eventually for with Quincy Jones. I mean, Give Me the Night, what a great song that is. I mean, it's R&B. It's not really jazz to any degree at that point. But I mean, Quincy in the late 70s was gold. Whether it was Michael Jackson, whether it was Rufus and Chaka Khan, whether it was George Ben, I mean, everything he touched was just, the Brothers Johnson were playing on most of those recordings. I mean, it's just fantastic, the funky pop disco stuff that they're doing at that point. Give Me the Night, what a great song that is. But Benson's early jazz work is really beautiful. He's a great lyrical player with a degree of soul that you probably don't hear as much in his later R&B stuff. And I loved Reason. I love a lot of his 70s work. It's really, and like I said, as a DJ in the black community for a long time, to a lot of the people in that community, that's what jazz was. Reason was jazz to them. I mean, the Blackbirds, Donald Byrd's 70s funk, Grover Washington. That's what they wanted when they said, "You have any jazz?" They didn't want trad jazz. They didn't want Monk or Miles. They wanted that. And it took me some time as a young white boy DJ to figure all that out. But I remember when I played Bitches Brew early on in the night one time, probably 8:30. And this is back when I still thought that was a seminal, wonderful recording. They were just like, "What the fuck is this shit?" I mean, they didn't give a fuck what the critics and reviewers said. They were like, "This shit's awesome." I mean, you don't want to see that face when you're DJing. And ultimately, it's a great measuring stick for any piece of music. Is what, when you play it as a DJ, if they're squinting and making the bad face, that's not a good sign. It's not what you want. But I mean, Morgan is unassailable. His body of work at Blue Note is so fantastic. He's gotten a posthumous fame that probably was denied him in his lifetime. And again, there's a few other works that I mentioned on the Tone Poet list of stuff that I look forward to seeing that stuff be issued as well. But all in all, it's a very good record. just not really what I was anticipating. Because you think of Lee Morgan in this era, you're thinking fomenting, churning, sometimes elements of avant-garde, sometimes elements of ferocity. And I mean, he kind of was always a chameleon. So, but great stuff. And again, Benson's really worth the price of admission alone. I'm going to jump through a few other things I've listened to recently. Lionel Hampton with Art Tatum and Buddy fucking Rich. And this is a clear-cut example of how great Norman Granz era verb is. Oh, I want to put a section together. Let's have Lionel lead it. Oh, let's have him co-lead it with Art Tatum. Let's put Buddy Rich on the drums. And in that trio, you have potentially the greatest of those instruments, each represented. I mean, you could make a strong case that Art Tatum is the greatest jazz piano player ever. And most of his work that you will find is him playing solos. So to hear him in a group setting is really fun. You can make a strong case that Lionel Hampton is the greatest vibraphonist in the jazz world. And you'd have a hard time really debating that. I mean, I love Milt Jackson, I love Bobby Hutcherson. There's a lot of great vibraphonists. Terry Gibbs was fantastic. There's a lot of great players. But Lionel Hampton, he's the progenitor. He's the Parker of that instrument. And then, of course, Buddy Rich. I mean, he won many a drum battle against the Gene Krupas and the Ginger Bakers and the rock and roll guys. I mean, Buddy Rich, that guy had a skill set. And again, race didn't really matter to Norman Granz. This was probably 55. Had a clef issue at 709, maybe 54. And so just on an offhanded whim, he's like, let's have these three guys record. And it's incredible stuff. Recorded brilliantly. It sounds amazing. And great cover. A great document. Norman Granz documents so much jazz legacy stuff, and people fucking sleep on it, man. You're talking three of the greatest people to ever do that music on a record together. I mean, literally, fuck most of what you know, most of what you heard, most of what you think matters. Fuck all of Miles Davis' body of work. I mean, it's so overrated in so many ways, and I love Miles Davis, don't get me wrong. I don't want to hear people commenting, oh, how can you say that? But it's so elevated above where it belongs in the canon. This is iconic work by three of the most important players, most influential players, most talented players, most underappreciated, undocumented players in today's jazz vocabulary. How is Lionel Hampton not spoken of more? How is Art Tatum overlooked as much as he is? And truth be told, in the mid-50s, all three of these guys, in spite of two of them being black, had a fairly good pedigree nationally. Buddy Rich, of course, was well known across the country, as most jazz players were at that time. But Tatum had been recording for Decca and for Capitol and for Columbia, and his records had good circulation. Tatum was such a prodigy that people knew about Tatum. And Lionel Hampton came to the fore with Benny fucking Goodman. So people knew who Lionel Hampton was. So these guys were all really well-established names, and this must have created somewhat of a stir in jazz circles in 55. And of course, by 55, jazz has been very much relegated to secondary status in terms of the popularity of music, with R&B and early rock and roll really kind of starting to take over. But early rock and roll is synonymous with rhythm and blues. And people so often forget that Chuck Berry and Little Richard comes straight out of the Jump Blues, and I have a lot of label compilations here from that era of the late 40s, early 50s. They're called Top 10 Hits of Rock and Roll, and it's just rhythm and blues stuff by black musicians. Rock and roll was rhythm and blues. It was just this kind of new name for it. It's not really until the 60s where we started getting that separation. And of course, the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin kind of codified it. I mean, we think of rock and roll, but even that stuff is so rooted in black American rhythm and blues. It's rock and roll. It's not a separate entity. I mean, there's a reason why those Stones records are filled with Chuck Berry songs. There's a reason why Paul McCartney does Little Richard. Ooh, I mean, these guys were incredibly exciting, incredibly innovative, incredibly brilliant. The innovations of Louis Jordan and so many others were so... I mean, James Brown was transformed by this stuff. And James Brown gives so much credit. And it dovetails nicely into this record, The Count. Some of this is bigger ensemble stuff with larger group. Some of it's a little smaller, if I remember. But what was most, again, me and Brian were talking about this, my friend Brian, who I do a lot of listening with. This has a lot of rock and roll in it. The band, the orchestra that he's playing with here, plays chords and notes like a single instrument a lot of times. For as many people as are on this, it's incredibly minimal. It's incredibly reduced down to simple sonic movement. And then little bassy flourishes here and there that are so minimal and open space. There's so much room for it to breathe and to swing and to be funky. And I mean, we were just kind of astonished at points just how much this was a predecessor to rock and roll. And I can't remember what song it was. Bobnail Boogie, maybe? I think it was a track number 3 on one of the sides, where the band is really minimal and basically just doing a little bit of talking in between on the piano by talking. It's phenomenal stuff. And there's a lineage here that must be acknowledged. Basie was a huge influence on Ahmad Jamal. And Ahmad Jamal was a very minimal open space player. And Miles Davis, when he was really trying to identify his sound and figure out what his niche was going to be, in the early 50s, he's already done The Birth of the Cool, he's done some recordings for Prestige and for Blue Note, but he hasn't really established who he is yet. And it's the discovery of that Harmon mute that Sweet Edison made famous, and others as well, that he becomes proficient at, and playing minimally like Ahmad Jamal, who played like Count fucking Basie. I mean, so it's important to understand the heritage and the connections that exist throughout this music. We should never think that these guys exist in vacuums and came up and were these brilliant isolated islands of creativity. It's a connected tissue that runs throughout the music. Red Holloway, a fantastic tenor player from mostly 60s into the 70s, and his body of work here is just incredible. And a lot of it's in R&B circles and blues circles, Chicago blues guys, Muddy Waters, forever, Willie Dixon, Howlin' Wolf. I think he has some work with Aretha and some of the Motown artists. But he also gets some jazz recordings as a leader and Prestige doing the soul jazz thing. And boy, there's some hints of King Curtis in this. There's some hints of Illinois Jacquette. There's some hints of Sam the Man Taylor. Real Harlem Nocturne, sweet tone. Lester and of course Webster again being channeled here on some level, but more R&B, rhythm and blues. And I mean, both sides of this record, when I was smiling if I had a hammer, opens up with fantastic, just big, beautiful, rich tenor saxophone, sax, strings, and soul arrangements by Benny Golson, and who Golson by this time was doing a lot of arranging. Holloway's a very kind of overlooked and forgotten player today. Chicago native, if I remember. Scott Baldwin, correct me if I'm wrong. But Holloway's just wonderful stuff, and he has a good half dozen records on Prestige, worth tracking down. These next couple records I'm going to show you, I've talked about this one infinite times, so I'm only going to briefly talk about it. But I was playing it for someone in the cafe the other day, and we talked about Locomotion, how it reinvigorated my jazz listening 10 years ago, how it changed my landscape, hearing and understanding what it was really saying and documenting how I was expressing emotion and my experience and how I feel about my place in the world. And it was actually Lee Morgan who really opened that door. It was a Pandora's box, like an epiphany, like, oh. I mean, it's a really incredible hard bop session by one of the great players. The whole band's incredible. Fuller's incredible. Morgan's incredible. Coltrane. It's Coltrane in a much more constrained range. His prestige stuff is almost unbridled. The sheets of sound, the endless notes, the endless ideation. Here with Blue Note, it's a little bit more rehearsed, a little bit more. We're going to do it multiple takes before we actually track it. We're going to give the space equally to Fuller and Morgan to solo. And he wasn't long with Blue Note. He does some side work on Blue Note with actually this fantastic Sonny Clark session with Donald Byrd, John Coltrane, Curtis Fuller. So these records come back to back, if I remember, 1577, 1576. So they're back to back in the Blue Note canon. But two of my favorite examples of hard bop. I just wanted to show them because I was playing them for a friend in the cafe. I had a group in here and they wanted me to explain to them some of the things I was talking about, the expression of music and how what hard bop was defining. They're like, well, show us. And so I played them some of that Sonny's Crib, and I played them some of that Blue Train, and I listened to the aggression, the tenacity, the fury, the controlled velocity. I mean, it's an expression of a frustration and a social movement that, again, they came from a Dave Brubeck experience, and they were overwhelmed by it. They're like, oh my God, I can totally hear everything you're saying. I could totally hear the frustration and the exhaustion and the willingness to keep fighting with all grit and tenacious effort that you can apply to it, because there was no surrender. And I mean, just talking with the social value and then playing them the music, it was really quite an experience. And last thing I want to show you, I played this in the cafe like a week ago, and I'm playing it 3 times. And what's interesting about this record, and again, transition, Tom Wilson in Boston, and it ends up being bought by Blue Note, and Blue Note Tone Put actually just reissued this stuff. But if you look at this lineup, what you have here almost in its entirety is a Jazz Messenger record. And it's a very young Donald Byrd before he's actually signed as a leader to Blue Note. And Bird's already done his work in the Messengers with that first group of Watkins and Mobley. They did those great Columbia recordings. He's kind of gone on his own as a leader, which Blakey kind of encourages guys to do. And he records 3 sessions for Transition, and then Blue Note signs it. And eventually Blue Note buys the Transition stuff. But if you, again, look at this band. It's Art Blakey, Horace Silver, Doug Watkins, if I remember, yep. So again, that's pretty much that early Jazz Messenger rhythm section. Don Byrd, Hank Mobley. So again, pretty much the fucking Jazz Messenger group from Columbia era. And then with a very interesting addition of Joe Gordon on trumpet. And Gordon, there's some fire in him here that you don't necessarily hear when Shelly Man and the Black Hawk. I mean, that's a bit more of a subdued, melodic, phrasing, contemplative sound. So it's interesting to hearing Joe Newman playing with his black brother in here in 1955-56 with full ferocity and tenacity. And it's a really vibrant, explosive recording, hard bop at its finest, Jazz Messenger canon in every aspect. This is a Jazz Messenger record. Again, there's not really even a debate to that. It doesn't have the name Jazz Messenger on it, but when you have Watkins, Blakey, Mobley, Silver, Byrd, that's Jazz Messengers. That's that classic Jazz Messenger lineup. And it really fits in that. And I think I almost had forgotten just how much of a Jazz Messenger record that was. So again, that's been Tone Poet reissued, if I recall. So Taru, in closing, nice session. Not your tenacious Lee Morgan, a bit more of a subdued. And George Benson's just fantastic on it. Fun record. And there's a lot of cool Tone Poet stuff that we talked about that we hope to see issued in the coming months and years. Thanks to Joe Harley and Kevin Gray for what they do. You guys are doing a fantastic job putting that jazz out there with the great artwork and making it affordable for people. So kudos to you guys. I mean, you don't need my praise. You guys know what you're doing. You're killing it. And appreciate you guys always commenting and supporting when you do. I appreciate you guys watching the channel at times. Everybody who wants to support the channel, we definitely appreciate that. You want to support us, go to Patreon, go to PayPal, any way you want. Help this channel out. it definitely does help me keep this channel going, keeping the cafe going. Y'all be blessed, y'all be safe. Make a smart choice in the election coming up, because the wrong choice could lead us back into a bad place. But no matter what happens, there's going to be some chaos. I mean, that's the one thing I'll guarantee you. There's going to be some chaos. But we still got a couple of weeks yet before we know the outcome of all that. So be strong, be safe, be smart, be blessed, spread love, and let's try to make the world a more positive place for everybody, because that's what we really need. And tolerance and empathy towards everyone is what the world demands of us. This hate and fear, it's time for it to go. So y'all be strong. We'll talk to you all soon. Peace.